Listen carefully. You were taught that the system is defended by walls, by guards, by force. You were told that if someone wanted to stop you, they would come at you directly, a confrontation, a visible barrier, a door with a lock you could see. That is the first lie, and it is the most expensive lie you will ever believe. The system does not build walls. Walls are expensive to maintain. Walls can be climbed. Walls can be photographed, measured, and mapped. Walls create martyrs. Walls create rallying points. A visible obstacle is an invitation to organize. No, the architect learned something far more elegant than force a long time ago. The architect learned that the most effective prison has no walls at all. It has paperwork. Pause on that, not metaphorical paperwork. Literal cascading, self-referential. Recursive administrative complexity, forms that reference other forms. Regulations that cite statutes, that defer to precedents, that loop back to interpretations that require certified specialists to decode. A labyrinth that was never designed to be navigated. A labyrinth designed to be entered and then quietly exhausted. This is the entropy tax. In thermodynamics, entropy is the measure of disorder in a system. Left alone, every closed system trends toward maximum entropy, maximum disorder, maximum diffusion of energy, maximum uselessness. The architect understands this at an almost cellular level. Because the architect does not need to defeat you. The architect only needs to introduce enough entropy into your path that your energy dissipates before you arrive at any meaningful destination. Think of it in terms of computational load. Every human being operates with finite cognitive bandwidth. Working memory, attention cycles, decision-making capacity. These are not infinite resources. They are depletable, measurable, and critically exploitable. When the operator designs a regulatory framework, a legal structure, a compliance architecture, they are not designing a system for administration. They are designing a system for attrition. Every additional variable you must track is a clock cycle stolen from your processing core. Every contradictory clause you must reconcile is a memory allocation that crowds out strategic thought. Every appeal you must file, every form you must notarize, every deadline you must calendar, these are not inconveniences. They are weapons, precision instruments of cognitive drain. The masses experience this as frustration, as bureaucratic incompetence, as inefficiency. That is the second lie, the one the system tells you about itself. It tells you the complexity is accidental, a byproduct of growth, a failure of coordination. It performs dysfunction so convincingly that you direct your anger at the machine rather than at the hand operating it. But entropy at this scale does not happen by accident. Entropy at this scale is engineered. A system that consistently, predictably, and universally exhausts the people who challenge it while smoothly processing the people who comply with it. That is not a broken system. That is a system working exactly as designed. Consider the asymmetry. The executor who built the framework does not navigate it. The kingmaker who funds the framework does not interact with it. The boardroom that benefits from the framework employs entire floors of specialists whose sole function is to translate the labyrinth into a navigable corridor for them, and only for them. The complexity that destroys your bandwidth is the same complexity that their infrastructure renders invisible. This is not inefficiency. This is differential friction. Engineered resistance that scales inversely with power. The more power you have, the less friction you experience. The less power you have, the more the system costs you in time, in money, in attention, in will. And here is where it becomes truly elegant, from a game theory perspective. The system does not need to stop everyone. It only needs to stop enough. If 93% of challengers exhaust their cognitive and material resources before reaching any meaningful leverage point, the remaining 7% become statistically manageable. Isolated, easily framed as outliers, easily absorbed, discredited, or redirected. You were never meant to win by fighting the rules. You were meant to exhaust yourself trying to understand them. So ask yourself this, and sit with the discomfort of the answer. If the complexity is not accidental, if the friction is not inefficiency, if the labyrinth was built by architects who never intended to walk through it themselves, then what exactly are you navigating, and who built the exit if there is one at all? Part 2 begins where this question ends. Who built the exit if there is one at all? The answer is precise, uncomfortable, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The exit was not built. The exit is a variable. It exists conditionally for specific actors, under specific configurations of power, and it is invisible to everyone who was never meant to use it. The labyrinth does not have one architecture. It has two, one for the architect, one for everyone else. This duality is not a flaw in the design, it is the design. And it operates through two principles, not metaphors, not abstractions. Functional, replicable, observable principles that the operator deploys with the same precision an engineer deploys load-bearing calculations. Learn these two principles, and the entire mechanism becomes legible. Ignore them, and you will spend your life interpreting the symptoms while the cause remains invisible. The first principle is this: asymmetric legibility. Every system of rules generates two classes of participant, those who can read the system natively and those who cannot. The boardroom does not merely have access to better lawyers, better consultants, better specialists. That is a downstream effect. The upstream cause is that the boardroom participated in writing the language the system speaks. The regulatory text, the compliance architecture, the procedural frameworks, these were not written in a neutral room by neutral actors. They were written in proximity to power, shaped by the executor's priorities, refined through the kingmaker's influence, and then released into the world as though they had descended from a mountaintop. Objective and universal. The result is a system that is natively legible to the people who built it, and structurally opaque to everyone else. This is not about intelligence. This is not about effort. A brilliant, determined challenger who spends 5 years learning the language of the labyrinth is still reading a translation. The architect reads the original. And in the gap between original and translation, entire strategic advantages are hidden, clauses that appear to restrict but actually permit, thresholds that appear fixed but are actually negotiable, procedures that appear mandatory but are actually discretionary for those who know how to ask. Asymmetric legibility means the same text produces different realities depending on who is reading it. For the masses, the rulebook is a ceiling. For the architect, the rulebook is a floor, a minimum surface from which to operate with everything above it open. The second principle is recursive compliance cost. This one is more mechanical, more brutal. Every act of compliance within the system generates a requirement for further compliance. You file a form. The form requires documentation. The documentation requires certification. The certification requires a licensed third party. The licensed third party requires a fee. The fee requires a financial disclosure. The financial disclosure requires an audit. The audit requires a timeline. The timeline conflicts with a regulatory deadline. The deadline triggers a penalty. The penalty requires an appeal. The appeal requires, and here is the elegant brutality of it, the same documentation you could not produce in the first place. This is not a loop. A loop implies the possibility of escape. This is a recursive function with no base case. In programming terms, it runs until the stack overflows. In human terms, it runs until the challenger runs out of time, money, or will, whichever collapses first. And the critical variable. The recursive compliance cost does not apply uniformly. For the operator, compliance infrastructure is a fixed overhead, absorbed into the architecture of the enterprise. Invisible in daily operations, delegated entirely to specialized personnel. For the individual challenger, for the small coalition, for the emerging disruptor, every cycle of that recursion is paid in real time. From finite reserves with compounding interest. Consider this. An independent executor, not yet part of the boardroom, not yet absorbed, identifies a structural inefficiency in a regulated market. A genuine one, the kind that, if corrected, would redistribute value from the entrenched players toward the periphery. She is not naive. She understands there will be resistance. She prepares for resistance. What she does not prepare for is silence. She files for the required operating license. The application is acknowledged. A processing timeline is provided 90 days. On day 89, she receives a notice. The application is incomplete. A supplementary disclosure form was required, a form that does not appear in the published application guidelines, but which is referenced in a subsection of a regulatory interpretation bulletin published 3 years prior, cross-referenced to an administrative memo available only through a formal records request. She submits the form. She restarts the 90-day clock. On day 61 of the new cycle, she receives a secondary notice. A compliance review has been triggered. The review requires her to demonstrate operational capacity, specifically a certified audit of systems she has not yet been permitted to operate, because she has not yet received the license she applied for. Pause on that geometry. She cannot prove operational capacity without operating. She cannot operate without the license. She cannot receive the license without proving operational capacity. The recursion is not accidental. It is load-bearing. It holds the structure of exclusion in place without a single visible act of hostility. Meanwhile, the entrenched players, the ones the inefficiency benefits, continue operating under grandfather clauses that predate the current compliance framework. They are not subject to the new audit requirements. They are not subject to the new disclosure standards. They exist in a regulatory layer that the architect preserved specifically for them, embedded in transitional language that no public summary ever mentions. She is not stopped, she is drained, her capital erodes. Her team fractures under uncertainty. Her investors, watching the timeline stretch, begin to recalibrate their risk models. The window she identified, the genuine inefficiency, the real opportunity, closes. Not because a wall appeared, because the clock ran out. This is the entropy tax collected in real time. No confrontation, no visible force. No martyr, no rallying point. Just a recursive compliance loop, an asymmetric legibility gap, and a challenger who ran out of bandwidth 3 steps before the exit she never knew existed. Part 3 does not offer comfort. It offers the only thing more dangerous than the system itself, A precise map of where its leverage points actually lie. Precise map of where its leverage points actually lie. Not a philosophy, not a framework for feeling better about the mechanism. A map, cold. Functional. The kind the architect uses and never publishes, because a map of the labyrinth, in the hands of someone who understands what they are looking at, is the single most dangerous object in any power asymmetry. So here it is. The labyrinth has three structural vulnerabilities. Not weaknesses in the moral sense. The architect has no morality to exploit. Vulnerabilities in the engineering sense. Load-bearing points where the architecture is thinner than it appears. Where the recursive compliance loops depend on assumptions that can be invalidated. Where the asymmetric legibility gap can be partially closed by someone who knows precisely where to apply pressure. The architect knows these points. The architect built redundancies around them, but redundancies are not invulnerabilities. They are additional costs, and the architect, despite all appearances, is not operating from infinite resources either. The architect is managing a portfolio of control mechanisms, each with a maintenance overhead. Pressure the right point in the right sequence, and the cost of maintaining that control begins to exceed the value of the asset being protected. This is where the game becomes winnable, not easily, not quickly, but precisely. The first leverage point is documentation asymmetry reversal. The labyrinth derives its power from the assumption that the operator controls the record. The regulatory history, the compliance trail, the procedural precedents, these live in archives the architect built. In language the architect wrote, indexed in ways the architect designed. The challenger enters this environment as a reader of someone else's library. But here is the structural crack. Every interaction with the system generates a record that belongs to both parties. Every notice issued must be issued in writing. Every denial must cite a basis. Every procedural requirement, once invoked, becomes a documented artifact, and documented artifacts can be analyzed, cross-referenced, and mapped against each other. The challenger who treats every interaction with the system not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a data point to archive, is building a counter-library. Slowly, expensively, but with compounding returns. Because the recursive compliance loop, when documented in full sequence, reveals its own geometry. And the geometry, once visible, becomes arguable. Not in the court of public opinion, that is a different game entirely. In the structural court of procedural consistency. The system must apply its own rules uniformly, or it exposes the differential friction it was designed to hide. Documentation asymmetry reversal does not break the labyrinth. It makes the labyrinth legible, which is the first condition for navigating it on your own terms. The second leverage point is cognitive load redistribution. Recall the core mechanism. The entropy tax works because it forces the challenger to process complexity in real time, from finite reserves, while the architect processes the same complexity through dedicated infrastructure. The asymmetry is not in the complexity itself. The asymmetry is in where the processing cost lands. The tactical implication is this. The challenger who attempts to absorb the full cognitive load of the labyrinth alone is playing the game the architect designed. The challenger who restructures their operation so that the load is distributed, specialized, and pre-processed before it reaches the decision-making core. That challenger has partially replicated the architect's infrastructure advantage without the architect's capital base. This is not about hiring lawyers. That is a surface-level reading. This is about architecture. It means designing your engagement with the system so that the recursive compliance loops are handled by a dedicated function, a person, a process, a protocol whose sole purpose is to absorb and neutralize entropy before it reaches the strategic layer. The decision maker never touches the form. The decision maker never reads the regulatory bulletin. The decision maker receives a single processed output: proceed, pause, or redirect. When the cognitive load of the labyrinth is redistributed away from the strategic core, the entropy tax is still being paid, but it is being paid from a different account, one that does not drain the resource the architect was targeting. Cognitive load redistribution does not eliminate the tax. It changes who bears it, and that shift in load-bearing changes the entire outcome trajectory. The third leverage point is legibility inversion. The architect's most durable advantage is opacity. The complexity of the system is maintained because complexity serves concealment. The differential friction, the grandfather clauses, the discretionary thresholds, the procedural exceptions, exists inside the labyrinth precisely because the labyrinth is too dense for most observers to map in full. Legibility inversion is the act of making the mechanism visible to an audience that was never supposed to see it. Not as a political act, not as a moral appeal, as a strategic move with a specific game-theoretic function. It raises the reputational cost of maintaining the opacity. The architect can sustain differential friction as long as differential friction is invisible. The moment the specific mechanism, the exact clause, the precise procedural loop, the documented instance of asymmetric application, becomes legible to a sufficiently large or sufficiently influential audience, the cost-benefit calculation of maintaining that mechanism shifts. The architect must now choose between defending the mechanism publicly, which confirms its existence, or quietly modifying it, which concedes the challenge. Neither outcome is a complete victory for the challenger, but both outcomes change the configuration of the board. And changing the configuration of the board is the only move available to a player who cannot yet build their own board. Legibility inversion does not destroy the system. It forces the system to spend resources it was not allocating, and every resource the architect spends on defense is a resource not spent on expansion. 3 directives: no comfort, no inspiration, operational precision only. First, documentation asymmetry reversal. Begin treating every interaction with the system as a data collection event rather than a compliance event. Archive every notice, every denial, every procedural requirement in full, with timestamps, cross-references, and source citations. Build your counter library with the same discipline the architect used to build the original. The challenger who holds a complete, sequenced record of how the system has applied its own rules gains the only form of leverage the labyrinth was not designed to neutralize: internal inconsistency, exposed and documented. Second, cognitive load redistribution. Immediately audit where the recursive compliance cost is landing inside your operation. Identify every point where strategic decision-making bandwidth is being consumed by procedural processing, and architect a dedicated function, human systemic, or both, to absorb that load before it reaches your core. Protect the strategic layer from entropy the way the architect protects theirs, through infrastructure, not willpower. The challenger who stops paying the entropy tax from their cognitive reserves changes the fundamental math of attrition. Third, legibility inversion. Identify the single most documentable, most specific, most structurally revealing instance of differential friction in your particular labyrinth, and make it visible to the audience most capable of raising the cost of its continued operation. Not broadly, not emotionally, precisely with documentation in the language of the system itself. The architect cannot defend opacity with more opacity once the mechanism has been named, sourced, and placed in front of the right observers. Force the defense, watch where the resources move. This is the map. Not a guarantee, not a shortcut, a precise set of coordinates inside a system that was built to have no coordinates at all. You were told the labyrinth was inescapable. That was never true. It was only made to feel true through complexity, through recursion, through the slow, engineered exhaustion of everyone who entered it without a map. Now you have one. Subscribe to AXIOM Protocol.